Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 235, and today I'm going to talk about this classic record from 1958, variously titled Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, or then subsequently, because of the popularity of its hit lead-off track, Moanin, known as Moanin. And what I have here is not the original 1958 Blue Note release. No, this is a scammy Russian reissue on DOL, a label which you should avoid, frankly, at all costs, with that telltale hiss, which suggests this is some kind of second generation product, a little tinny, a little two-dimensional, avoid. So in terms of what to expect, this is of course Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, the quintessential hard bop group, although ironically a group which rarely maintained the same lineup from one album to another or year to year. There are in fact something like 60 different well-known jazz musicians who have cycled through this group between 1954, when it really gets going, until Blakey's death in 1990. This record is acclaimed as one of the high points of the Jazz Messengers output. It is what you would call pretty muscular hard bop. It's not background music by any stretch of the imagination. It's also not particularly subtle music, at least I don't find it that. And for me, at times, the balance between bombast and swing is a little tested. Art Blakey is born in Pittsburgh in 1919. He's born to a single mother who dies within a year of him being born. Rough start to life. Dad's not in the picture, and he and his siblings are actually raised by a family friend, a woman called Annie Perrone. When he took up music, it wasn't actually the drums in the first case, it was actually the piano. And perhaps because of his rough start in life, he becomes self-reliant quite early. By grade 7, apparently he's making pretty good coin playing piano professionally here and there. In his early teens, he switches from the piano to the drums, allegedly because of some incident where a nightclub owner points a gun at him and asks him to play the drums so that Errol Garner, who of course went on to have a fantastic career as a pianist, could take the piano chair. Not that plausible, and Blakey himself denies it, but it's a good story. At the end of the 1930s, when he was about 20 years old, his first serious recurring gig happens when he starts playing with the piano player Mary Lou Williams, who was a bit of an institution by that point in Pittsburgh. After a period of time playing with her, sometime between 1939 and 1942, he ends up moving to New York, and he gets a gig with the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra. The Second World War, of course, begins for the United States in the late part of 1941, but this doesn't actually impact Blakey because while he was touring with the Henderson Band in Georgia, he'd been assaulted by a white police officer, and as a consequence of head injuries, basically being beaten with a baton, he'd actually had to have surgery and have a metal plate put in to patch up a hole in his skull. This had rendered him unfit for service, and for jazz musicians who were either in his circumstance or were young, there were all kinds of opportunities in the war years playing in orchestras in New York where some of the members had been called up into the services. So in 1944, he ends up playing with the Billy Eckstine Band, and he stays with them until they break up in 1947. And this is really his introduction to the big time, because some of the other people who were in that band around the same time were Miles Davis, Dexter Gordon, Fats Navarro, Sarah Vaughan, and Charlie Parker. After the war and after the Eckstine Band breaks up in 1947, Blakey can't get a gig right away, and so he decides to travel to Africa. Not, as many assumed, to study the drums, but actually on a bit of a personal journey of intellectual, moral, philosophical, religious discovery. And he spends quite a bit of time in West Africa over the next couple of years, converts to Islam, and in the process changes his name, temporarily anyway, to Abdullah ibn Buhaina. His conversion to Islam was never as thorough, let's just say, as some of his contemporaries. On the one hand, he did come back and lead a band called the 17 Messengers, which was a largely Muslim band where the inspiration was largely Quranic. On the other hand, apparently he would have prayer meetings while a practicing Muslim, but then go out for drinks and ribs. Eventually, by the early 1950s, he'd gone back to using the name Art Blakey. In the 1950s, he spent the first part of the decade largely playing in support of some of the great names of the bebop era: Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, Bud Powell, Dizzy Gillespie, and most of all, Thelonious Monk, with whom he had a great musical relationship which would last many years. At this time as well, like so many people in the bebop orbit, he begins using heroin and stays a user for an extended period of time. A fairly high-functioning user, managed to contain successfully his own use. There's more to the story, which I'll touch on a bit later. The big development in Blakey's career happens in 1954 when, along with Horace Silver, he co-founds the Jazz Messengers for the first time. This version has Blakey on drums, Silver on piano, Kenny Dorham on trumpet, Hank Mobley on tenor, and Doug Watkins on bass. That group disbands in 1956, and then in the next 2 years, there's a whole bunch of Jazz Messengers lineups which last for this or that length of time. Eventually, things settle down in 1958, and Blakey returns to Blue Note to make his next record, and he brings in a new band which is composed of members, all of whom except for Blakey are from Philadelphia. And this begins what is basically the classic period of the Jazz Messengers from 1958 until 1964. This record's made October 30th, 1958 in Rudy Van Gelder's parents' living room in Hackensack, New Jersey, with Rudy Van Gelder being the engineer. Being a Blue Note production, Alfred Lion, of course, is the producer. Blakey's on drums. Lee Morgan, whose history I've described in some other reviews, is on trumpet. Benny Golson's on tenor. He's part of this Philadelphia music mafia that's joined up with Blakey at this time. He comes from that incredibly fertile scene, which included the Heath Brothers, which included Philly Joe Jones, which included Red Garland, and of course included John Coltrane. Golson leaves almost immediately after this record is made because of the drug culture in the band, and this was an issue which had also caused a split between Blakey and Horace Silver earlier on. He would soon go on to form the Jazztet with Art Farmer, and then, much like Oliver Nelson did, would then move to Hollywood and spend much of his later career producing TV and movie scores. On piano, it's Bobby Timmons, of course, from Philadelphia too. He's a guy whose musical tastes ran very much towards the bluesy and soul-oriented aspects of jazz, and because of that, he tended to get typecast as not being, a serious, cerebral jazz musician, unfairly and actually, I think, unkindly, because his contribution here is a big part of why the better parts of this record are as good as they are. Finally, on bass, the last of the Philly Mafia here is Jimmy Merritt. He was a guy who had classical training on double bass, but had actually spent most of his professional career working in blues, jazz, and R&B, including a couple of years with B.B. King just prior to making this record. Side one starts with Moanin, the big hit off this record, and written by Bobby Timmons. Begins with that famous piano riff, and then you have Morgan's very sweet entry on trumpet, beautifully high-pitched. It's just breathtaking, as is his whole solo. And then it's Benny Golson's turn, and immediately you can hear the influence that John Coltrane has had on this generation of sax players. The next track is Are You Real, which is the first of a number of Golson compositions here. This was co-written with Morgan. I'm not as taken with this track as a lot of people are. I find the head arrangement kind of big bandy and a bit dated. Benny Golson's work is great, but I don't think Morgan hits the heights he did on the first track. For me, the highlight of this track actually is the bass solo by Jimmy Merritt towards the end. I do, however, love the last track on this side, Along Came Betty, which has this lovely minor key opening driven by Merritt's walking bass. Morgan's work is bluesy and dynamic. I think Golson's solo is right up there with anything he did on any track, on any record. And Bobby Timmons, whose trademark is never really accepting fully that he's on a jazz date, when he's playing, plays this awesome, almost juke-jointy piano solo. Side 2 starts with a bit of an oddity, which is a 3-part composition written by a tenor sax player to feature a drummer, and it's called the Drum Thunder Miniature Suite. And it's appropriately named. The first movement is all about this ominous work on toms by Blakey. Cry a Blue Tear has this great little riff which repeats in various keys, and then the third movement is Harlem's Disciples, which evokes the big pre-war jazz dance club scene in Harlem. Overall, a lot of great ideas in this. I don't really feel it necessarily all comes together as a whole, although I may be in a minority. Next we have Golson's Blues March, which became a bit of a standard in its own right. This is pretty much what it says on the tin, a blues march. This was already feeling to me like a very masculine record at this point, and this little bit of Four on the Floor basically continues in that vein. The final track, however, really swings, and that's the standard Come Rain or Come Shine. In summing up this record, I have to confess I'm not the biggest convert to the Art Blakey thing. I respect his technique, I respect and really admire his capacity to bring together all these great bands over time and attract all this talent. But in terms of his own playing, I find him a bit of a sledgehammer, candidly, compared to, say, Elvin Jones or Tony Williams, some of his better-known contemporaries. Now, obviously, some of that's just my own personal preference, or all of it's my personal preference, I guess. I would say the compositions on here by Golson and by Timmons are excellent, and the playing on here is technically very good. The bottom line here is that there are 6 songs in this record, the brilliant title track and 2 other excellent tracks. The other 3 I find to be a bit of a mixed bag. For me, this is 4 out of 5 stars.